One of the things that I've noticed over the years is how often people seem genuinely confused by the fact that I'm not married and never have been. When I was pregnant with my son, I attended birthing classes with a good friend who had agreed to be my birthing coach. And the teacher was kind of rattled. There were portions of the class where they split up the participants, expectant moms in one room, husbands in the other. My friend asked the instructor where she should go. And the answer was, we don't really know. The birthing class may have been the first time that I bumped headfirst into the assumption that I was married, but it was far from the last. Consult your husband and let us know what you decide, a technician said to me when our HVAC was on the fritz. As I told your husband last week, my son's swim teacher said to me at a lesson, referring to my son's father, who had brought him to class the week before. No one means any harm, and at this point, the husband references kind of roll off my back. But it is noteworthy how frequently I'm confronted with the reality that marriage is the norm. Or at least it is, for moms who look like me. But a lot of other moms experience the reverse.
What these scholars did was a qualitative study. They interviewed Black women with children, whether pregnant or having their kid around.
That's Dedrick Williams, a professor of sociology at the University of Tennessee.
And one thing that the women talked about is how they're still viewed as if they're single mothers, even if they have a ring on. But if they're alone with their child, the default assumption is that they're single mothers. And I think that's a byproduct of a long narrative of assuming that people who are racialized as Black, their default familial patterns are one of non-marital childbearing.
These assumptions didn't just come out of thin air. They were shaped by decades and decades of policymaking and cultural narratives.
And one thing that we have seen over time is the assumption that Black folks are like anti-marriage, don't want to get married, always in the kind of perpetual non-marital childbearing context. So because of those particular interpretations of Black life is so prevalent, even when Black women are married, the study is really showing how that particular set of ideologies and structures often misinterprets Black life regardless of their realities.
I'm Julie Kohler, and this is White Picket Fence. Last episode, we explored how marriage became a tool used to create order, define cultural norms, and maintain hierarchies of inequality. We got up close and personal with the immense coercive powers that went into defining the American marriage ideal. But what happens when people deviate from this norm? Today, we're looking at the flip side of marriage fundamentalism, the belief in the superiority of the two-parent nuclear family, and exploring our country's long history of penalizing single mothers, especially if they're poor and Black. We can trace many of the assumptions about Black single mothers back to one government document, known as the Moynihan Report.
And Moynihan said that with that number of young Black males growing up in single-family homes without fathers to socialize them, to civilize them, growing up without the expectation of a marriage culture, this population is doomed.
Today, pro-marriage advocates frame this messaging as real talk, as though they're just speaking the truth.
Ultimately, I should say, the Moynihan Report was an attempt to have an honest conversation about family breakdown and Black pathology. Faulting ghetto culture for ghetto outcomes remains largely taboo.
But what they're actually doing is shaping a narrative that places all of these so-called social ills on the shoulders of Black unmarried mothers. While commonplace in conservative circles today, this ideology that family structure will impact how well children do in the world, whether they will graduate from high school, get a good job, or end up in jail, came from a very specific time in modern America. And perhaps surprisingly, it came from a Democrat. an up-and-coming politician in the Department of Labor named Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Today, if people know Moynihan's name, it's mostly as the long-serving senator from New York, or as the namesake of the new fancy train hall in Manhattan. But back in 1965, he was just a young bureaucrat who wrote a report about Black families, which he subtitled The Case for National Action. He said the country's inner cities were in disarray, that Black children were dropping out of school, that their neighborhoods were riddled with crime, and that the number of Black Americans living below the poverty line was alarmingly high.
Moynihan himself came from a single-family household and had quite a bit of instability in his life growing up. And so, we can even imagine how his own experience would have influenced the kind of urgency that he brought to this particular project.
That's Diane Stewart, a sociologist from Emory University. She is the author of Black Women, Black Love, America's War on African American Marriage. In her work, she looks at the long-running effects of this report on Black couples and families, and the way that Moynihan placed blame for what he called social decay on single Black mothers.
What Moynihan did was he blamed all of the problems for the discrepancy in poverty levels between Blacks and whites upon what he called the matriarchal Black family. He blamed it on Black women.
Moynihan never actually meant for the public to see his report, but it leaked. And seemingly overnight, one single internal government document permanently changed how the country thought about marriage, poverty, and personal responsibility. The Moynihan Report, as it was written, isn't a moral screed, but the conclusion that many people drew from it is that Black families headed by single mothers were deviant. If you read the full report, you'll see that Moynihan flagged a number of issues, unemployment, for example, and the fact that schools weren't making much progress on integration. But the one that made the biggest impression, and is still hanging around today, was that Black families needed to dismantle matriarchal households and replace them with something else.
Of course, something that was, patriarchally based, what would be the standard normative family. In no way did Moynihan look and say there are different cultural patterns for family households.
His report affirmed the belief that family structure, specifically families headed by single mothers, caused people to be poor. The newspaper articles, television segments, and political debates that followed spread this belief all over the country.
A peculiar normalcy has taken over in these precincts of America.
The essence of the report is that the Black family, particularly in those poor ghettos, is continuing to be torn asunder.
Do you think that Mr. Moynihan's theory is essentially a racist theory?
No, I don't think so. I think the consequences of it may be racist, but I don't think in origin it's racist.
The ghetto is a cage, and its walls are mirrors. So a child grows up with no role model as a father in the house. A child grows up with a mother on welfare and assumes that's the norm.
Once it got into the American stream of consciousness, there was no turning back. It would go on to serve as the backbone for a range of far-reaching and expensive policy initiatives, then and now. Eventually, the media frenzy surrounding the Moynihan Report died down, but the ideas that it planted had taken root.
In the 1990s, this self-identified marriage movement grew. Part of this was being propelled in many ways by family and social science scholars who were saying that children do poorly when they're raised in a single-parent family.
That's Melanie Heath, a sociology professor at McMaster University. She's been studying this moral fervor since she was a graduate student in the 90s.
At the same time, you had, the rise of the religious right. Over time, the religious right really became united in many ways with the Republican Party. And so you started to have a lot of pressure to make changes to things like welfare. We can't talk about all this without really talking about race, of course. By the 1990s, you had an increasing rise in single parenthood in the white population. The decreasing number of marriages in the United States was also starting to be noticed.
The increasing calls for marriage equality and rising rates of single parenthood made people panic. All of this was a threat to the ideology that Moynihan helped define, that nuclear families would keep America prosperous and productive. Instead of taking the time to address what might have been causing family stress and separation, or re-examining how the nation should define marriage, our government doubled down. They began crafting a new brand of policies, whose sole purpose was to educate, encourage, and prepare people for marriage. These policies were specifically targeted at low-income women. Advocates claimed that marriage would help lift them out of poverty and set their kids on a better path. Sound familiar?
You have the Defense of Marriage Act that was passed in 1996, and that specifically defined marriage as between one man and one woman. And then at the same time, the same year, you had the passage of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act.
These long-winded policy titles are easy to get lost in, but stick with me. Out of this new legislation, a program called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, more commonly known as TANF, was created. TANF ended 60 years of federal cash benefits to poor families.
Now, what TANF does is it gives block grants to states. It's not necessarily an entitlement to welfare support. And so states can use this funding, this grant block that they get for other purposes. And one of those purposes that was listed as acceptable is the promotion of marriage.
So, money that used to go directly into the pockets of poor families was now being invested in programs that tried to teach people the skills they supposedly lacked to get a spouse. This policy actively shifted the responsibility for social failures, like high levels of poverty, onto individuals. And of course, it didn't stop there. When President George W. Bush came into office,
he began the Federal Healthy Marriage Initiative. And this basically added a patchwork of funding of about $200 million for marriage promotion activities across the country.
And by 2005, there was another $500 million allotted to marriage promotion programs. States used that money to offer free marriage workshops, sometimes called sweetheart weekends.
There are all kinds of programs that are using this funding, but there's still that grounding in the idea that marriage is the superior form of family that the government needs to support, and that this is what will provide the best outcomes for children. So it's a fairly explicit ideology that is behind many of these programs.
And the results? Not great. The Healthy Marriage Initiative, as expensive as it was a categorical failure. It did nothing to reduce poverty, nor did it move the needle on marriage rates at all. Continuing to focus on relationships and family structure, despite no evidence that it actually works, is a choice, a punitive one.
I think things like welfare reform, the healthy marriage initiatives are all a byproduct of, to be honest with you, politicians who come from an orientation or the assumption that inequality is a byproduct of the individuals themselves. And I think that's what we have been chasing since the Moynihan Report. And that's how we have seen this kind of legacy of policies that try to promote marriage to end inequality.
Dedrick Williams, who we heard from earlier, has a theory as to why Americans can't let go of the marriage solution.
There's a bias towards marriage as an institution already, and then the empirical science shows that marriage has these positive outcomes. Then the default assumption is that marriage is a universal good. See, like people should just get married. But on the other hand, many scholars, including myself, are asking, is it really marriage as an institution itself Or is it the unequal distribution of resources within the society? Who has and who doesn't have is often associated with who gets married. So it's not about marriage in and of itself, but rather the conditions that people have before they even enter the institution of marriage, right?
The research also bears this theory out. A recent study showed that if single motherhood disappeared from the United States entirely, the poverty rate would only decrease by about 1%. Turns out, single motherhood doesn't drive poverty. What does play a role is structural racism.
In fact, my work shows that if you're racialized as white and have an unmarried birth, you're still less likely to be poor in terms of poverty compared to Black and Latinx women who are married in some cases.
It's how those mothers are treated that makes them poorer. Think about it. We live in a country that won't provide universal health care, publicly funded childcare, paid family leave, and has a huge racial wealth gap. The lack of these safety nets is a penalty to poor single mothers. It's a punishment. These poor outcomes among single-parent families are unique to the United States. No other rich Western industrialized nation sees such a disparity between married and single-parent families. And yet, we keep focusing on the wrong thing.
What ends up happening is that there's an investment in people's marital life and not their economic life. You can't just abracadabra your way through marriage or healthy relationships to basically decrease inequality.
In other words, the gap persists because barriers persist. And in America, we ignore centuries of racist policymaking that created these inequities in the first place.
The legacy of chattel slavery, for example, the legacy of Jim Crow, and the legacy of contemporary laws and policies that have good returns for some and not so good returns for others is something that we have to really, really grapple with. Because if we assume a universalism, I think that's what has gotten us in trouble in this country and will continue to get us in kind of quote unquote trouble in terms of the stability of inequality in this country.
Despite all of this evidence, one view continues to get promoted: the belief that poor single mothers, especially Black single mothers, don't marry because they're deficient in some way, that they have poor relationship skills, don't value marriage, or are just different from other women. But what if we actually listened to Black women about their experiences with love and marriage? Diane Stewart, the author and sociologist we heard from earlier, has created an entire body of work around this idea. She calls it forbidden Black love.
I define forbidden Black love as the structures and systems that make coupling, marriage, and love difficult, delayed, or impossible for millions of Black people in America. This conversation with Black women about unfulfilled desires for partnership, for dating, just even dating, coupling, marriage, is the longest unfinished conversation in my adult life since my college days.
Diane coined the term forbidden Black love because she wanted people to see marriage in a very different way, as a civil rights issue.
And one of the reasons I emphasize that it's a civil right is because we often talk about this issue and we all understand why as a personal issue. Marriage is personal. It's intimate. It's interpersonal. We experience it at the individual and couple level. But the truth is, it is also a civil institution. The fact that African Americans had to gain the right to marry as a civil right already tells us that this is a civil rights issue.
Moynihan and his believers were right about one thing. Since the 1950s, Black Americans have married at lower rates than white Americans. Where there's disagreement is why. Rather than individual decision-making, Diane emphasizes the structural factors that have undercut marriage.
And so, how do you move from property to human status with liberal human and civil rights. And so marriage was included in how the government began to adjudicate what it meant to move African Americans from property to human being.
As we mentioned in our last episode, coming out of slavery, marriage rates in Black communities rose quickly. So how did we get to the idea that Black women weren't built for marriage? We go back to Dedrick Williams' point, that marriage doesn't magically solve inequity. By the time we were coming out of World War II, the government was actively incentivizing white marriages. They gave mostly white returning GIs money for school, for houses, all of the nuclear family building blocks. But Black veterans were often shut out of those benefits. Black marriage rates started going down.
So Black women really began entering welfare programs in the 1950s, 1960s. And it's at that moment when we begin to see these austere measures and policies being developed, because there's this stereotype or this perception of Black women that they are inept mothers, that they are promiscuous, that they're grifters, that they can't be trusted.
States developed extensive monitoring operations to ensure that no cash assistance would be provided to households where a man was present. But Black men often weren't paid living wages. Poor Black couples were de facto barred from marriage, and some families were forced to live separately.
Literally, this thing is called man in the house, substitute father, and suitable home.
Beginning in the 1960s, families applying for benefits who had a man in the house were disqualified.
The social workers would go into the projects or wherever the welfare recipients were living by surprise often and visit the home, interview the mother, the children, look at what was in the home. They would often go into washing machines, stoves, and ovens because they figured people would be hiding and stashing things there. They would look for men's bedroom slippers, men's toothbrushes, etc. And if an able-bodied man was found in the home, their benefits would be cut off, would be removed.
The result was that Black marriage was disincentivized, and Black women were pathologized as bad mothers. Policies surrounding marriage, welfare, and family life might be more productive today if instead of naming matriarchal culture as the problem, Moynihan had focused on reforming discriminatory practices. Or if, from the outset, we viewed different family formations as adaptations to certain social conditions, adaptations that are now becoming more universal. Here's Dedrick Williams again.
What many scholars often say is by the time America sneezes, Black folks have already had the flu. And so I think with these trends, because we live in a racially unequal society, the inequality hit families of color harder and earlier. But as these particular set of conditions in terms of economic inequality persist, it started affecting white Americans as well. And people are like, how do you expect me to get married when the cost of living is outrageous?
Yes.
When even if I get an apartment, right, those rent is expensive, mortgages are expensive.
If eradicating poverty and solving inequality are really our goals, we know it works. Just 2 years ago, the federal government cut child poverty rates by 2/3 with an expanded child tax credit. Other experiments with forms of guaranteed income have shown similarly beneficial results. Take the Magnolia Mothers Trust experiment, for example. In this initiative, low-income Black mothers in Jackson, Mississippi were given $1,000 each month, no strings attached, for 12 months. The results were transformational. Mothers were able to meet their basic needs and to prioritize their children and families. But even more importantly, the cash led to a greater sense of agency. The bottom line is that if we see forbidden Black love as a civil rights issue, it forces us to address much broader structural forces, and it leads to dramatically different policy solutions. Ones that go way beyond just promoting marriage.
personally, I really believe that addressing inherited poverty and wealthlessness is the most important thing to do. Of course, I do talk about reparations in the book as well. For me, that's a dignity issue. And Julie, I'm a scholar of religion. So I think about these things from the perspective of a humanist. This nation doesn't love Black people. It doesn't love Black men. It doesn't love Black women. It doesn't love Black children. It does not. Because if it did, our dignity, our worth would have long been recognized through reparations.
The longer we stay focused on marriage, the more these other paths are obscured. It's not that they're not possible. We're just distracted from the tactics that work. And that's on purpose. Because the marriage promotion movement was never really about reducing poverty. The existence of state-funded education on the benefits of coupling up serves one main purpose: to roll the responsibility for social inequity onto individuals. The marriage panic we're currently facing doesn't stop there. Some of the pro-marriage policies being floated involve serious attacks on our freedoms by proposing some big changes, not just to marriage laws, but to divorce. Next week on White Picket Fence, we'll explore divorce in the United States and what our country might look like without it.
You start with this sort of expansive vision from feminists about what the rising divorce rates could mean for how we rethink the social safety net. And you end up with not a rethinking of the social safety net, but real deeper embedding of marriage as a status in it, but just now bringing divorce as a status related to marriage into that.
White Picket Fence is a Wonder Media Network production. Our producers are Maddie Foley, Carmen Borca Carrillo, Abby Delk, and Lauren Williams. Our editor is Lindsay Cradwell. Executive producer is Jenny Kaplan. Original music by Sean Patel. Special thanks to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Shared Ascent Fund for their generous support for this season.